The crystal chandeliers cast glittering light across the ballroom at Ravenwood Manor, as Duke Nicholas Ravenwood delivered another cutting remark to his wife Cecilia in front of assembled guests, his voice carrying just the right tone of aristocratic disdain as he commented that her gown was entirely unsuitable for the evening, and that she had once again failed to meet the standards expected of a duchess. The guests had shifted uncomfortably at the public humiliation, some exchanging knowing glances that suggested this was far from the first time they had witnessed the Duke treating his wife with such obvious contempt. Cecilia had responded with the same composed dignity she always displayed during these performances, lowering her eyes in apparent shame and murmuring an apology before withdrawing to the edge of the ballroom, where she stood alone while her husband charmed other guests with the warmth he never seemed to direct toward her. To every observer in that room, Duke Nicholas Ravenwood appeared to thoroughly dislike his wife and to make no effort to conceal that dislike from society. What absolutely no one in that ballroom understood, except for Nicholas and Cecilia themselves, was that every insult he delivered publicly was protecting her from a family that had already murdered his first wife, and that would certainly kill Cecilia too if they believed she mattered to him. Duchess Cecilia Ravenwood was 26 years old, possessed of a delicate beauty that combined pale blonde hair with unusual violet blue eyes, slender build that carried itself with natural grace, and intelligence sharp enough that she had understood within weeks of her marriage exactly what her husband was doing and why. She had been raised as the only daughter of a country gentleman of modest means, educated well beyond what most women received because her father had believed minds should be developed regardless of gender, and she had entered her marriage to Nicholas with realistic expectations about aristocratic unions being primarily strategic rather than romantic. What Cecilia had not expected was discovering that her husband was conducting an elaborate performance designed to keep her alive by making his family believe she was worthless to him, and therefore not worth eliminating. Duke Nicholas Ravenwood was 34 years old, tall and commanding with dark hair and intense green eyes that held secrets he shared with almost no one, possessed of the kind of classical aristocratic features that painters favored and that concealed depths of strategic thinking most people never suspected. He had inherited his title at 23 when his father died under circumstances that Nicholas had always believed were suspicious, but which had been officially ruled accidental, and he had spent 11 years navigating a family dynamic that was as dangerous as it was dysfunctional. Nicholas's family consisted primarily of his uncle Lord Ambrose Ravenwood and Ambrose's two sons Philip and Gerald, all of whom stood to inherit the dukedom if Nicholas died without producing an heir. Ambrose was 58 years old, possessed of a calculating coldness that had made him wealthy through business ventures that often operated in legally gray areas, and he had been systematically positioning himself to inherit since his brother's convenient death 11 years earlier. Ambrose had two sons who shared his ambitions and his lack of moral constraints. Philip was 32 years old, charming in public and ruthless in private, possessed of expensive tastes that consistently outpaced his actual income, and that made inheriting the dukedom increasingly attractive as his debts mounted. Gerald was 29, less overtly charming than his brother but more directly dangerous, with a reputation for dueling and for resolving conflicts through intimidation or violence that he was skilled at deploying just short of attracting legal consequences. Nicholas had married for the first time at 25 to Lady Rosalind Fairfax, a gentle woman he had genuinely cared for, and whose warmth had been obvious to everyone who knew them. Rosalind had been 22 when they married, sweet-natured and kind, completely unprepared for the viper's nest she was marrying into, and she had died 18 months after the wedding in what had been ruled a tragic accident when her horse had bolted during a morning ride. Nicholas had investigated Rosalind's death privately and had discovered evidence that her saddle had been deliberately tampered with, that the horse had been drugged to make it skittish, and that at least one witness had been paid to claim the death was purely accidental. He had confronted his uncle with this evidence, and had been met with cold denial, and with a warning that pursuing accusations without proof substantial enough to overcome Ambrose's connections would result in Nicholas himself facing unfortunate accidents. Nicholas had recognized that he was essentially trapped. His uncle and cousins were willing to commit murder to inherit the dukedom. They had connections that protected them from legal consequences, and they would continue eliminating anyone Nicholas cared about, until eventually eliminating Nicholas himself when opportunity permitted. He could not expose them without evidence that would overcome their political protection, and gathering such evidence while keeping future wives safe required strategy that would take years to implement. So Nicholas had developed a plan that was as brilliant as it was personally painful. He would remarry, but he would treat his new wife with such obvious contempt that his family would believe she meant nothing to him, and would therefore see no benefit in eliminating her. While maintaining that protective fiction, he would work methodically to gather evidence of his family's crimes, and to build sufficient legal and political support to eventually expose them safely. Nicholas had chosen Cecilia specifically for this terrible charade, because she was intelligent enough to potentially understand the strategy if he could ever safely explain it, and because she came from a background modest enough that her family lacked the social connections to investigate or to interfere if his treatment of her appeared problematic. He had courted her perfunctorily, had married her with minimal ceremony, and had immediately begun the public performance of disdain that had now continued for 3 years. What had made the situation infinitely more complicated was that Nicholas had fallen genuinely and completely in love with the wife he was pretending to despise. Cecilia's intelligence, her quiet strength, her ability to endure his public cruelty without breaking or becoming bitter, all had combined to make her precious to him in ways that made maintaining the performance increasingly difficult even as it became more necessary. Cecilia had understood what Nicholas was doing approximately 6 months into their marriage, when she had accidentally overheard a conversation between Ambrose and Philip, discussing how fortunate it was that the Duke clearly cared nothing for his second wife, and how her potential death would therefore not distract him from his duties, or make him dangerously focused on investigating circumstances, the way he had after Rosalind's accident. The realization that her husband's cruelty was protection rather than genuine dislike had reframed everything Cecilia had experienced during those first months, and it had led her to make a decision that was either courageous or insane, depending on perspective. She had confronted Nicholas privately in his study late one night, and had told him directly that she understood what he was doing and why, and that she was willing to endure the public humiliation if it was truly necessary to keep her alive. Nicholas had been stunned by her perception and by her willingness to accept the situation, and he had finally been able to explain fully what had happened to Rosalind and what dangers Ambrose and his sons represented. That conversation had been the first honest communication between them, and it had established a partnership that had sustained them both through 3 years of performing contempt publicly while building genuine affection privately. The private moments they shared were precious and carefully concealed. Nicholas would visit Cecilia's chambers late at night when the household was asleep, and they would talk for hours about everything from estate management to philosophy to the evidence Nicholas was methodically accumulating against his uncle and cousins. Those conversations had revealed that they were remarkably compatible intellectually and temperamentally, and what had begun as strategic partnership had evolved into genuine love that neither could safely acknowledge publicly. Cecilia had also proven to be invaluable in gathering evidence against Ambrose's family. Because everyone believed Nicholas despised her and therefore dismissed her as insignificant, she moved through the household and through social gatherings essentially invisible to people who were careful about what they said around the Duke, but who spoke freely in front of his worthless wife. She had overheard conversations, had observed meetings, had documented interactions that provided crucial pieces of the comprehensive case Nicholas was building. 3 years into this terrible arrangement, Nicholas had finally accumulated evidence sufficient to expose Ambrose's various crimes, including embezzlement from family trusts, bribery of officials, conspiracy to commit fraud, and most importantly, enough circumstantial evidence regarding Rosalind's death and Nicholas's father's death to trigger official investigations that Ambrose could not simply dismiss through his connections. Nicholas had spent months carefully positioning this evidence with allies he had cultivated over years, ensuring that, when he finally moved against his uncle, it would be comprehensive enough that Ambrose could not retaliate or escape consequences. He had also made arrangements to protect Cecilia by having her moved to a secure location before the evidence was revealed, ensuring that any desperate final actions by Ambrose could not reach her. The moment Nicholas chose to spring his trap had come during a family gathering at Ravenwood Manor, where Ambrose, Philip, and Gerald were all present. Nicholas had arranged for magistrates and investigators to arrive during the gathering with warrants for arrest based on the evidence he had provided, and he had ensured that sufficient officials were present that Ambrose could not simply bribe his way out of immediate consequences. The scene had been dramatic as officers had entered the drawing room and had announced charges against Ambrose Ravenwood for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder, with additional charges being filed against Philip and Gerald for their complicity in various crimes. Ambrose had attempted to bluster about connections and influence, but Nicholas had ensured that the evidence included testimony from people Ambrose had believed were loyal, but who had been convinced to cooperate in exchange for immunity or reduced charges. The investigations that followed had been thorough and had ultimately resulted in convictions for all three men. Ambrose had been sentenced to 20 years for embezzlement and fraud, with the murder conspiracy charges pending additional investigation. Philip had received 15 years for his role in the embezzlement and for separate fraud he had committed. Gerald had been sentenced to 12 years for assault and for intimidation of witnesses in previous investigations. With his uncle and cousins imprisoned and their threat neutralized, Nicholas had been free for the first time in years to publicly acknowledge his wife as someone he valued rather than someone he despised. The change had been dramatic and had shocked society that had spent 3 years watching the Duke treat his Duchess with contempt. Nicholas had hosted a ball specifically to reintroduce Cecilia to society, and his behavior toward her had been so obviously affectionate and respectful that guests had been completely bewildered by the transformation. When people had questioned the change, Nicholas had explained simply that previous circumstances had required discretion about his private feelings, but that those circumstances had been resolved, and he was now free to treat his wife as she deserved. The explanation had been deliberately vague, but had been sufficient to quiet most speculation, and society had gradually accepted that the Duke and Duchess of Ravenwood were apparently happily married despite years of evidence suggesting otherwise. Some people had guessed at the truth or something approximating it, but most had simply been relieved that the uncomfortable public displays of contempt had ended. Cecilia had emerged from 3 years of being treated as worthless into a position where her husband publicly valued her, where society was forced to acknowledge her as a duchess worthy of respect, and where she could finally be recognized for the intelligence and capability she had always possessed, but which had been deliberately concealed to protect her life. She had also begun working openly alongside Nicholas on estate management, and on the charitable endeavors she had been pursuing quietly during the years when everyone believed she was just the Duke's despised wife with nothing better to do than ineffectual good works. Her projects had actually been quite effective, but their success had been attributed to the competent staff she had assembled rather than to Cecilia herself, and now she could finally receive appropriate credit for work she had been doing all along. The transition from performing contempt to expressing genuine affection had been adjustment for both Nicholas and Cecilia, requiring them to essentially relearn how to interact publicly after years of carefully maintained fiction. But they had discovered that the foundation they had built during private late-night conversations was stronger than the performance they had maintained publicly, and their marriage had flourished once the necessity for deception had been removed. 5 years after Ambrose's imprisonment, Nicholas and Cecilia had 2 children and had transformed the Ravenwood estates into models of progressive management that benefited everyone involved. They had also established legal and financial structures that ensured the dukedom could never again be threatened by ambitious relatives, as the inheritance was now protected by trusts and oversight that prevented the kind of manipulation Ambrose had attempted. Ambrose himself had been released after serving 12 years of his sentence, his health broken, and his wealth entirely gone through legal fees and restitution. He had lived in reduced circumstances supported by distant relatives who resented the burden, and he had been forbidden from coming within 50 miles of Ravenwood properties as a condition of his release. Philip had been released after 10 years, emerging from prison diminished and desperate, his expensive tastes now impossible to support on the minimal income he could generate through legitimate work. He had emigrated to America seeking fresh opportunities and had been moderately successful in business there, though he had never recovered the social position or the wealth he had enjoyed before imprisonment. Gerald had served his full sentence and had been released at 41, his health damaged by harsh prison conditions and his violent tendencies somewhat tempered by years of forced restraint. He had found employment as a security guard and had lived quietly, avoiding the family that had disowned him and making no attempts to contact Nicholas or Cecilia. Nicholas and Cecilia had built an extraordinary partnership over 15 years of marriage, the first 3 years of strategic deception having created foundations of trust and understanding that most couples never achieved. They had survived circumstances that would have destroyed most relationships, and they had emerged stronger and more committed than marriages built on easier foundations. Their children had been raised with full knowledge of the family history and of the sacrifices their parents had made to protect each other, and they had learned from that history the importance of protecting people you love and of being willing to endure temporary hardship for long-term security. 20 years after their marriage, Nicholas and Cecilia hosted a reception at Ravenwood Manor to celebrate the anniversary, and during the reception, Nicholas had raised a toast to his wife that had finally acknowledged publicly what she had endured during those first 3 years. To my Duchess, who survived being publicly despised by the man who privately cherished her, who understood that cruelty shown in public was protection offered in private, and who partnered with me to destroy those who threatened us both. Society believed I hated her, but the truth was that I loved her enough to pretend otherwise until I could safely acknowledge what she meant to me. Cecilia had smiled at her husband with the warmth that had been concealed for 3 years and that had been freely expressed for 17 since, and she had offered her own toast in response. To my husband, who protected me through performance and who trusted me to understand strategy that most would have considered incomprehensible. He pretended to hate me to keep me alive, and when the danger passed, he spent every day since proving that the contempt was fiction while the love was always genuine. Guests had applauded, most of them understanding finally the full story of the Ravenwood marriage and appreciating the remarkable nature of what Nicholas and Cecilia had built together from such difficult beginnings. Ambrose had learned of the anniversary celebration from newspaper accounts and had sent a bitter letter to Nicholas complaining about his continued imprisonment having cost him everything, while Nicholas celebrated triumph. Nicholas had read the letter once and had burned it without response, recognizing that Ambrose had earned his fate through his own choices and that no amount of resentment would change the consequences he now faced. At 54 years old, Nicholas continued managing the Ravenwood estates effectively, while also serving in Parliament, where he had become known for advocacy of legal reforms that protected vulnerable people from being victimized by those in positions of power. His own experience with Ambrose's criminality had made him passionate about creating systems that prevented such abuses. Cecilia at 46 had become one of the most respected women in their region, known for her charitable work and for her keen business sense that had contributed substantially to the Ravenwood prosperity. She had also written extensively about women's education and opportunities, and her essays had influenced thinking about what roles women could and should play in managing estates and businesses. Their partnership had become legendary in circles that knew their full story, held up as example of how strategic thinking combined with genuine affection could overcome even the most dangerous circumstances. They had proven that love could survive being concealed when necessary, and that trust built during adversity created foundations stronger than trust that had never been tested. The 3 years when Nicholas had pretended to hate Cecilia had been painful for both of them, but those years had also created intimacy and understanding that easier marriages never achieved. They had learned to communicate in glances and subtle gestures, to trust absolutely even when appearances suggested betrayal, and to maintain hope through circumstances that would have broken people with less determination. Their revenge against Ambrose and his sons had been comprehensive and permanent, achieved not through violence but through patient accumulation of evidence and through strategic deployment of legal mechanisms against people who had believed themselves untouchable. Nicholas had destroyed those who had murdered Rosalind and who would have murdered Cecilia, and he had done it in ways that ensured they could never threaten anyone again. Cecilia had been protected through performance that had cost her dignity temporarily, but that had preserved her life permanently, and she had emerged from that protection to build a life of genuine achievement and recognized worth. She had survived being publicly despised and had thrived once the necessity for that deception had ended. If this story about protection, sacrifice, and strategic deception resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more complex narratives. Comment about whether you think Nicholas's approach was justified or whether he should have been honest from the beginning despite the risks. Your engagement helps these stories reach others who appreciate morally complex situations.